On the build show today, Cork Insulation. That's right. This big insulation panel is made from natural cork, and the building behind me is entirely insulated with cork. We're gonna get into all the interesting features and benefits of this insulation I'd frankly never seen before. Let's get going. All right, guys, let me introduce you to Greg. Greg is the builder on this project, and his supply company supplied all this. What are we looking at, Greg? What is this?
So we're looking at 2 inches of solid 100% natural cork insulation. So yeah, this might seem like a really crazy new product, but it's actually one of the oldest insulation products in the US.
So the same kind of cork is like a wine bottle that you pop the cork out of, the same material?
Yeah, so it's the same stuff. So like when you take like a cork bark out, like you're popping that out of a thick kind of like layer of cork bark, and then you've got all these leftover granules, and then you're able to steam heat them. So when you steam heat these granules, they expand, and then when they expand, the natural binder in the cork, suberin, releases. So it's acting as this natural glue to hold this whole thing together.
Wild.
So then you get these solid, solid panels that can act as continuous insulation and a final cladding for your house, acting just like, kind of cork bark does in nature.
Wild. And so these are like 2 foot by 4 foot that comes in a bundle. It's actually pretty heavy. Like, what'd you say? This bundle's 45 pounds?
Yeah, it's like 45 pounds. Yeah, it's pretty dense. It's pretty dense stuff. And cork is just this really wild, kind of wild material where it insulates like foam. It's about R4 an inch.
Pretty heavy.
Pretty heavy.
Yeah.
But it cuts like wood. And then when it silvers out, it kind of has this sort of like stone-like quality to the texture.
And so you've got a rain screen and a siding going on here, or what's happening?
So this is it's a very simple wall assembly actually, and that was one of the things that really attracted me to it. There are 2 main things happening here. One, it's working with carbon storing or carbon capturing plant-based materials.
Yeah.
So this is a 3-component wall assembly. On the inside, we've got about 4 inches of cross-laminated timber from sustainably harvested Doug fir and spruce in the case of this house. And then we've got our self-adhered control layer, VaproShield Wrap Shield SA.
Okay.
So that's acting as a vapor open air and water control layer. And then on top of that, we have these 2 inches of cork.
And the cork's just adhered right onto that. Is it glued on, or how'd you attach the cork?
The cork is screwed, actually. So it's screwed through the shiplap. So like when you're working with the cork, it's like, okay, like we're able to hold the cork down here and be like, all right, we're gonna put a screw here. You can usually just get it, kind of get it going on the ground.
And then screw it home.
Yeah.
So you've got just a waffle head or a bigger washer head is what I meant to say.
So this is a fast cap power head screw. Mm-hmm. So just a nice like
a cabinet hanger screw.
Exactly. And you could probably do it with something that doesn't have quite as big of a head, but this has got gives you kind of a nice grip on the shiplap of the cork.
That's pretty sweet.
So yeah, you're able to put this up, and it's got a four-sided lap. So this is what you're seeing here with all the seams,
So you've got another one over here that's covering over that. The screw's hidden back here. The next panel comes in and it's hidden behind there.
Yeah, next panel comes in and covers it. Yeah.
Also interesting to see, now you can see a little bit of this weathering. So what you're actually seeing here in this house is your final finish. There's no siding, there's no stucco. It's going to be a cork finished house, a cork exterior.
Yeah, I mean, what are they it's basically tree bark for your house, but cork just has very unusual properties, which is the reasons that people have used it for, cork barks for wine and whiskey, etc., for hundreds of years. And it is a natural, technical material. They've actually used cork on space shuttles, and they still use cork on space shuttles because it's able to insulate, it's able to provide critical insulation for shuttle launches. And then when it burns, because this kind of booster rocket is kind of burning off, it burns at a steady kind of predictable rate.
Wow.
So it does something that comes in, basically comes in handy in engineering scenarios but this is literally 100% cork. It's only its natural binder holding it together.
It's wild.
Yeah, it's pretty amazing.
And leftover pieces of this would break down if you put them in a landfill or your garden mulch bed too, right?
Correct. Yeah, it's still
natural...
totally a natural material. So it's biodegradable, compostable, the whole bit.
And ultimately, this will silver out and probably stay that silver finish and not have to do any maintenance to it, I'm assuming?
Exactly.
That's pretty wild.
Yeah, and actually, if you hit it with an orbital sander, we did this once. It's only this outer, very, very thin layer that is silvered. It comes back to that chocolate color just with about like 5 seconds with an orbital sander.
That's pretty wild.
It's pretty crazy, and part of the reason is it's a hydrophobic material. So like, we were talking about this, like the cork itself has a cellular structure. Mm-hmm. So you think about wood having a porous kind of fibrous structure where these little tubes where water can kind of flow through it, because that's what the wood is doing for a tree in its natural setting. The cork has a cellular structure. It's like a closed cell, sort of like foam type structure, where it's hydrophobic. It is not wanting to accept, water into into the material.
Just like holding the wine into the wine bottle for the next 30 years as the wine ages. Same thing. The wine's not leaking out.
Exactly.
Even though the bottle's on its side. That's pretty wild.
Yeah.
Now talk to me about cutting it and handling it. And in fact, let's use this pop out as an example, because I think this kind of shows what you can do with it. How do you cut it?
So you can cut it with all your like typical carpentry tools. So we've used table saws, track saws, skill saws, jigsaws, routers, and fine saws.
Is that right?
Yeah.
Fine tool on your insulation.
We've used all those. Like I think like this little piece we probably did with the fine saw. I think that got cut with the track saw. This got cut to width with a table saw.
That's so cool.
Those curves up there we cut with the track saw.
So on this bevel cut right here, I would have thought that as the saw blade was rolling, that this would pop out and you'd see a bunch of pock marks. But in fact, it looks to me like it's really intact. It also, honestly, feels pretty durable.
It's soft to the touch, but it's not soft to the squeeze. Right, like when you really got to get in there, it's a 9 pound per cubic foot material. So you think like foam, like typical like spray foam's like 2 pounds a cubic foot. Wood's about 30 pounds a cubic foot, 30 to 40 depending on the species.
Yep.
So it's this really nice in between where it's hard enough so that you can cut it. You don't have to worry about like being like ultra like delicate with it when you're like kind of running it through the blade, but then it's also like light enough that it's a ton of fun to work with.
I bet.
So it's not like trying to like lug something that's like 80 pounds up a ladder or anything. It's like the panels are going to be maxing out at about 5 pounds each.
And speaking of which, man, you guys had some fun over here. I didn't introduce Greg fully at the beginning, but Greg is also the founder of a really well-regarded design build firm here in Austin, Texas called Moontower. And man, you guys show your design chops on this. Check this out. This projection on this Marvin window you've got here is all cork. Talk to me about what you did here.
Yeah, so this is, this whole wall is what we called like the experiment wall. So basically we were looking for opportunities to use the cork in, interesting, kind of ways. So what we did here is kind of starting at the head is we actually created a cork projection that's sloped on the top and then has a kerf at the kind of the underside, basically for, for a drip line. So it's essentially kind of like a cork head flashing.
So cool.
And then we kind of kept those, basically kept these bevels and angles kind of coming around, coming around the jamb, and then put a little bit of a slope on the sill, and then another like kind of curve cut at the back. Just to do something like in this case that has, a little bit more of a modern kind of contemporary look, kind of creates an interesting sort of like shadow feature. It's also like deep enough that you can see it from the interior. So like when you're like kind of coming up to this window, like you actually start to see the cork from the interior.
That's pretty cool.
Yeah, and it's something that you don't usually, you talk plenty about insulation, but you don't usually get to expose the insulation with the final product. So it's like okay, this is this is a cork.
Cool.
This is the thing that's keeping your house warm or keeping your house cool. But it's also something that has this really interesting, like, kind of natural story, like a sustainability story, and that's something that we want to really celebrate with the architecture of this building.
Talk to me about fire resistance. What happens if you got something that happens and could this catch fire? Would this catch fire?
It's a class B kind of fire resistance, so that falls into the same category as like solid sawn timber.
Okay.
So you're not at like a class A. But yeah, it's like the
really
cork
no
cork
different than
can
having-
burn, but it's like a lot of these materials where, like with solid sawn timber, like that it'll burn if the point of ignition, like if you're holding a lighter, like it's right there. But if you remove that, like
It doesn't stay lit.
it'll char, and then kind of
makes sense.
exactly.
And you also used it in some pretty cool ways here, where you kind of varied the width and the depth to get that shadow line, which I bet architects would absolutely flip for.
Yeah, so here we tried using just different thicknesses, some like inch thickness and then some 3/8 inch thickness to create some different patterns and different sort of reveals with it. We even used some like standard grade cork to vary up the texture a little bit. And it creates some interesting shadows, and it's just a fun feature that we wanted to experiment with.
Pretty awesome.
Yeah.
Now, what happens if there's a job site accident, or something hits the house or scrapes it? Is there any way to repair or fix or do anything like that?
Yeah, I mean, we can take a look at a big boo-boo on the front of the house, but for small stuff, you can see like here, like this is like what would be like a small sort of defect, and like the pattern of the cork, there's so much happening with it, like that a lot of these things, like they just don't pop out.
Yeah, it disappears.
And then you can also take a little granule in your finger, like dab a little like Tite Bond 3, the exterior Tite Bond on it, and just stick it in there.
Oh,
and
wow.
we've done that on a couple places in the house, and it works great. But the big boo-boo's up here.
So tell me the story. What happened, Greg?
Our plumber, who's wonderful, he was backfilling. He's backfilling our drain line over here, and he got a little too close to the corner of the house without even realizing it with the Kubota mini excavator. You've got a picture of one of these things.
Oh yeah.
And so he hit it with the bucket. So I came back and saw this, and I've got some pictures of this. Saw this chunk that had come out of the cork that was about the size of my hand. But I was like, first I was like, oh, that's not great. But here I was like, wow, like it actually came out in one clean chunk.
Yeah.
The wrap shield, the Vapor Shield kind of WRB behind it wasn't damaged at all because it didn't get back to it because this 2-inch cork was too thick for it to get damaged. The CLT, everything back behind was totally fine. And then I looked down on the ground, and there were 4 big chunks, like including this, big corner chunk here that were just down on the ground. So I was able to basically puzzle them back together. And then I took a bunch of like cork dust that we've, got saved and mixed that with Tite Bond 3, and then was able to like fill that in and just like kind of put it up in there.
A little wabi-sabi, as the architects call it.
Yeah.
A little imperfection. I love that you don't hide it, and there's a great story to be told there.
Yeah.
It's pretty cool.
I think it's more, being a builder for over a decade at this point, I'm sure you'd sympathize. It's like, damage, wear and tear to the house is something that's going to happen.
Yeah, things happen.
Yeah, it's not, and sometimes it's something where it's like, oh yeah, like it's part of the story of the house.
Totally.
But if you wanted to do this like really cleanly, it's like we could come in with a fine saw and just like cut out a really nice rectangle and stick something in there, and it would also disappear.
That's wild. So compare this now to, a thermoplastic type insulation on the outside of a house. What are the pros and cons of using cork versus a more, kind of normal insulation?
Yeah, so I mean, where I kind of first really came across the cork was, at a big picture, was reading a couple books like New Carbon Architecture and then Build Beyond Zero. Mm-hmm. And both those books talk a lot about the potential for plant-based materials to sequester carbon, to actually capture carbon while that tree is growing. You know, this is just the bark of a tree, and then actually harvest it and then kind of store that carbon in a building for, you know, for the long term.
Yeah.
So compared to like thermoplastics, this cork is actually a carbon negative material.
Neat.
Like there's more carbon stored in this cork than it actually took to produce the cork.
Cool.
So that was a big selling point for me. Then when you get into sort of performance, from an R value perspective, as I mentioned, this is about R4, you know, R4 an inch. You know, your foams are going to vary from between R5 to R8, depending on the type of foam. But cork actually has a really interesting property called thermal diffusivity, or also sometimes called thermal lag.
Okay.
Where like foam, like we mentioned earlier, is usually between 2 to 4 pounds a cubic foot.
Okay.
In terms of its density,
Yep.
and then it also has a really low specific heat.
Okay.
So, and specific heat is basically a measure of like, okay, how much energy, how many BTUs, how many joules do I need to put into a material to raise it 1 degree?
Okay.
So, cork has a high specific heat and also has a higher density relative to foam.
How many pounds per cubic foot?
This is 9 pounds a cubic foot.
Okay.
So you're, you know, working with something that's like 2 to 3 times the density of, you know, 2 to 3 times the density of your cork and of your foam, and has a higher specific heat. So what happens with this is when you have a lot of heat gain that's kind of hitting the cork, it diffuses. This thermal diffusivity. The cork actually acts as like kind of a sponge for heat.
Huh.
And it absorbs into the cork and keeps absorbing until it kind of hits the kind of capacity, that sponge capacity, that kind of like thermal battery of the cork.
So like the dry sponge on your kitchen countertop, you drop the BTUs as the sun hits it, and it absorbs that before it soaks through the other side, so to speak, right?
Yeah, and that's like the kind of thermal lag part of the concept, where it's like until this thing is kind of like at its thermal capacity, that heat is not going to start moving through the, you know, to the other side.
That's awesome.
So like RDH Building Science actually did a test on on cork versus polyiso at like similar comparable R values. So I think it was like 6 inches of cork and then 4.5 inches of polyiso. And so they applied heat, like in kind of one of these R value tests, they applied heat on one side and then they were measuring the temperature on the other side. And it took 6.5 hours for the same kind of like heat input to travel through 6 inches of cork. And it only took 1.5 hours for that same heat input to travel through 4.5 inches of polyiso.
Wow.
But the R values are the same.
That's wild.
So yeah,
So it's not just R value, in other words.
It is not just.
There's something to this mass.
There's
in this kind of thermal sink, so to speak.
Exactly.
That's pretty wild.
Yeah, no, it's pretty cool.
All right, the $1 million question, which I know people are going to ask, can you talk to us about cost at all?
Sure.
I know this is not for everybody.
Yeah.
And I want to preface this by saying, you know, it's interesting to see here where when you first walk up, you think, oh, the house is under construction, and you know, I wonder what the siding is going to be. But no, this is rain screen, insulation, and siding all in one. So there is some other additional benefits with this, as long as you like the style, right? You have to like this look. But if you like this look, what are we talking about?
Yeah. So like this material, so this is at a 2-inch thickness. So I'm stocking, or we will be stocking in basically an 1.5 inch version, like a slightly, kind of slightly thinner version. So that's going to end up being about R5.5 rather than this being about R7.
Okay.
And that here will be about $7.10 a square foot. Freight can be a big part of like the, kind of like cost of insulation, because basically insulation is generally like a relatively low weight but high volume sort of material. So like freight is a huge deal when it comes to the insulation world.
Big deal.
But that's one of the reasons that we started Cross Cabin Build and Supply, is like to try to help close that like availability gap for using materials that have a better, our carbon storing, have a much better kind of environmental footprint.
Yep.
So yeah, like $7.10 square foot for this kind of like 4-sided lap cork. And then this material in an inch is about half that, like $3.50 a square foot.
Okay.
And then the insulation grade cork is even kind of less than that a square foot.
Gotcha.
So in about a 3/4 inch sheet, it's about, I think, $2.50 or something.
So you could even potentially use this as strictly just a facade material, like cladding, if you wanted to. You could buy it in these thinner grades just for that, even if you didn't want it for exterior insulation purposes.
Correct. Yeah. I mean, so if you just use this in the kind of inch or like 3/4 inch like facade, you can glue it on there. It's going to help out with your insulation value a little bit, like about an about an R3.
Yeah. It's pretty good.
So that's that's an option as well. Like in this case, with this being a cross-laminated timber panel home, the cork is my kind of primary thermal control layer with this with this project.
So cool, man. I really like it. Greg, how can people get a hold of you if they're interested in this, and what else do you guys do?
Sure. So Cross Cabin Build and Supply, we're supplying cork, hemp wood, hemp wool, and then also some like critical components for like cross-laminated timber assemblies. Like, so we supply Vapro Shield, and then we also supply Simpson Strong Ties, like mass timber connectors.
Okay.
So Simpson Strong Tie over the last few years have been kind of rolling those out. So we do the supply side, but then we also offer kind of a pilot sort of program for these types of prototype projects, because obviously like I'd never seen a house like this before we started building it. Yeah. So but we're the mission of Cross Cabin Build and Supply is really to make a kind of plant-based zero carbon building mainstream in Austin, Texas and beyond.
That's cool.
Really cool. One of the things we want to one of the things we're doing in partnership with with Moontower Design Build is building these pilot projects. So you can have your own cross-laminated timber and cork, hemp, wood fiber house, and we can do the full design build package for you.
That's wild.
Yeah,
super cool, man. I really appreciate you having me out today. I'll tell you what, we need to make another video on this house though, because there's so much of a story to be told here beyond just the insulation and the cork and the cool factor here. How about we come back and give these guys a tour of your house for the next video?
I'd love it.
All right, guys, thanks for joining us. I'll put full contact info for Greg and Cross Cabin in the description below, but if you're not currently a subscriber, hit that subscribe button. We've got new content here every Tuesday and every Friday. Follow us on TikTok or Instagram, otherwise we'll see you next time on The Build Show.